Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our latest event at the Institute for a Greater Europe. For those who don't know as much about us, we're a pan-European youth-led think tank, and we're based in Brussels, and we engage with issues that relate to the European Union and wider European issues as well. And we're very excited to welcome our latest guest speaker, Ishaan Shah, this evening. And just by way of a quick introduction about Ishaan, he is a 19-year-old international human rights, gender equality and climate action young leader and the founding director of Stolen Dreams, co-founder of the Youth for Freedom Collective, two international youth-led collectives working with stakeholders, and is engaged at UN level trying to fight modern day slavery. So someone who is very highly qualified to talk about this issue and how we as young professionals and as students can combat modern slavery. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand the microphone, as it were, over to Ishaan.
Thank you so much, Sam. I will share my screen. Fantastic. Yeah, so thank you so much for having me this evening. It's really a pleasure to be here and speak to you all about the important topic of modern slavery and human trafficking. And thank you very much, Sam, for the introduction. So yeah, I'm Ishaan, 19 years old. I'm in my second year studying international relations at King's College London. And I'm the co-founder of Stolen Dreams and the Youth for Freedom Collective, which are essentially two international youth-led collectives working to counter modern slavery and human trafficking internationally. We are a network of probably close to over 1,000 now of young people who are working on their own projects in their own grassroots communities on tackling modern slavery in their situations, in their contexts. And they also hold a number of positions within the UN system, a number of different various hats with a number of different UN agencies. So the first focal point, for example, with UN Office on Drugs and Crime for the review and implementation of the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, working with UN Women at the moment on a very specific intergovernmental process that happens every year within the UN system, and a number of different organizations as well, predominantly focused on human trafficking, on migrant smuggling, and anything to do with young people really, and promoting our meaningful participation in UN deliberative and decision-making processes, and really getting young people involved into the intergovernmental negotiations that are happening, not only in New York, but also in Geneva and Vienna and Kenya and all the various processes that are happening throughout the world. And every day in the work that I do, I'm very fortunate enough to spend much of my time with survivors, with organizations and policymakers and experts, really learning from the best minds in the world in these fields. And I've been in the anti-slavery sector since 2016, so since I was 13 years old. And I've really traveled deep into this movement, always learning at speed and recognizing intersectionalities. And so ultimately the work that we do with Stolen Dreams and with Youth for Freedom Collective and all of these mandated positions in the UN system essentially works on mobilizing stakeholders to meaningfully center youth in decision-making spaces to facilitate that comprehensive, that concrete and bold action to end modern slavery in all its forms wherever it may occur. But modern slavery is this word that's often thrown around quite a lot today. But what exactly does modern slavery mean? And modern slavery is a term that's not defined in international law, and it's a term that really popularized in 2010, largely stemming from the UK when Theresa May was Home Secretary, when she was championing the cause of combating modern slavery through policy and at a governmental level. But to explain modern slavery in its true form without masking it with its politicization, I'm going to briefly explore its historic roots, because it's essential to contextualize the forms of exploitation that we see today. So essentially the abolition of slavery and the slave trade across the world, and what we abolished in the 19th century, and it was in 1833 here in the UK, was not the abolition of slavery-like practices. Rather, it marked the abolition of the legal right to own someone else. And that's what was pushed through Parliament. So we never actually abolished exploitative practices. So when the abolition of the slave trade happened, this gave rise to new forms of exploitation. And those very forms of exploitation are the ones that we refer to today as modern slavery. So for example, plantation owners, they panicked because they were suddenly being told that it was illegal to have slaves. And essentially they wanted free labor to generate as much profit as possible. And that mentality of profits over people, in other words, the way our economic system works, that really turned into a trade of millions of Indian and Chinese people that was shipped and transported to colonies who work on plantations under the same conditions, if not similar conditions, to the historic slavery that we understand. And this was referred to as indentured labor at the time. In the Caribbean, men who had been enslaved, they were redesignated as apprentices and they were not paid for many years. So when we observe the way that politicians and companies grandstand about how we must rid the world of this evil and eradicate modern slavery, while failing to understand or even recognize those historic and systemic factors, it is clear that there is a severe problem with the mainstream anti-slavery discourse. Because the thing that we are talking about now is what our economy has been running on for centuries. And this narrative must change. I really believe that we as youth and young people play a critical role in challenging the current anti-modern slavery movement, learning from history, navigating through controversies, and paving the way for meaningful progress. So what we can see essentially is that modern slavery and exploitation of people has really been deeply embedded and rooted in the socioeconomic fabrics of our politics, of our economies and systems and societies over centuries. So today, modern slavery as a term generally refers to the wide range of severe situations of exploitation, where a person is heavily dependent on another and cannot escape because of mechanisms of force, coercion, control, violence, deception, and abuse of power. And these can be physical, but they can also be psychological. And today, this involves several highly exploitative practices, including forced labor, bonded labor or debt bondage, forced marriage, the worst forms of child labor, organ trafficking, sex trafficking, online sexual exploitation, state-imposed forced labor, and human trafficking, to name a few. And human trafficking is essentially one of the main forms of modern slavery that exists. And this involves the recruitment, transportation, and harboring or receipt of persons by means of threat or use of force or other forms of coercion or fraud. And ultimately, human trafficking is about having control over another person, moving them from one area to another for the purpose of exploiting them. Unfortunately, what we see today is that politicians are using these terms human trafficking and migrant smuggling interchangeably to justify their anti-immigrant and hard border policies, when in fact these are two distinct crimes. Migrant smuggling involves the transportation of people across international borders and stops when the person has reached their destination. Human trafficking can be the movement of people within a country, from one town to another, or even one house or room to another. So there essentially doesn't have to be an international component to human trafficking. But for human trafficking to be human trafficking, there must be the act, so for example, the transportation or the recruiting, the means through these mechanisms of fraud, force or coercion, and then the purpose for the intent to exploit them into a form of modern slavery. So for example, into forced labor. And I hope that this foundational terminology makes sense because it is important that we have a basic understanding as to what modern slavery and human trafficking are before we even begin to look at their impacts and how they manifest today. And before I continue, I'd also like to note that the figures and the data I talk about today are merely estimates. And one of the problems that the anti-slavery movement faces is data collection, because it is incredibly complex and challenging to get accurate or substantial figures on the rates of exploitation globally, due to vague definitions, but also due to the fact that this is a hidden crime, hidden in plain sight. And this is an area that the sector needs to work on and needs improving on. And the anti-slavery sector ultimately needs to obtain these high-level quality, reliable baseline estimates in order to develop effective strategies to tackle this issue. But nevertheless, the data today suggests that there are over 50 million people trapped in modern slavery globally. 1 in 4 people in slavery are children, and a 2020 report by the Walk Free Foundation estimates that 1 in every 130 women and girls globally is in some form of modern slavery. And this really is a global issue, but it's not just an issue happening in faraway countries and faraway communities. Modern slavery exists right here in the UK, across Europe, and likely wherever you are tuning in from today. And we are encountering slavery and exploitation every day. The coffee you have this morning, the device in your pocket, the clothes you're wearing or they're in your wardrobe, the chocolate bar in your snack drawer, your lunch or dinner, the nail bar or car wash on your high street, the cleaners at the hotel you last visited when you were on vacation. These are all goods and services that are essentially at very high risk of being produced or operated using modern slavery in their supply chains. So essentially, to end modern slavery, we need to see radical and systemic changes that are needed to address and prevent the root causes that enable exploitation in the first place. And many governments across the world claim to champion the cause of fighting modern slavery, just as they gut human rights and social protections, defund labor inspections, roll back on hard-won laws and legal victories made by unions, champion hard border and anti-immigration policies, and give even greater power to businesses who perpetrate forced labor in their supply chains. And what we have seen and continue to see is that with the compounding crises of COVID, climate change, and conflict, is that there have been profound disruptions to the way in which we can prevent exploitation in the first place. Firstly, these intersecting crises have exacerbating existing vulnerabilities, particularly in terms of economic vulnerability and security. Poverty, climate change, and gender inequalities are some of the root causes and driving factors behind exploitation. And traffickers are smart, they're clever, they're always looking to exploit these vulnerabilities. They're always 5-10 steps ahead of the sector as a whole. So this really points to a long-term need for change, including an increase in community resilience, considering the needs of people already in exploitative conditions, as well as those with increased vulnerability to modern slavery. And we have the solutions. We have the chance to build back better and create economies and communities that value everyone. And these solutions are urgently needed to be adopted. And so to contextualize the issue, I will go into a bit more depth about modern slavery in a European context. So if we start with conflict, as a result of the Russian Federation's invasion of Ukraine last year, many millions of people have been displaced both within Ukraine and beyond its borders. Faced with one of the fastest growing refugee situations in recent history, countries across Europe and beyond have taken decisive action to support people fleeing this conflict. In addition to following foreign policy responses, such as coordinated international sanctions on the Russian Federation, military support, and humanitarian aid to Ukraine, both state and non-state actors must also now turn their minds to prevent this clear humanitarian crisis from turning into a human trafficking crisis. Because there is already established evidence that conflict is a driver of human trafficking, and there continues to be a clear consensus within the sector that the war in Ukraine presents real and significant risks of human trafficking and exploitation, particularly for displaced women and children who are disproportionately impacted. Lack of income generation opportunities, interruption in the provision of essential services, issues with the rule of law, internal displacement have all contributed to the heightened risks of exploitation. And inside Ukraine itself, access to income generation and to essential services and goods, including food and water, heating and electricity, is further deteriorating. And we know that internally displaced people and people in areas of active conflict are at a heightened vulnerability to physical and sexual violence, to trauma and other abuses. And this in turn increases the risk of sex trafficking, of labor trafficking, and exploitation in armed conflict, particularly for children, minorities, especially Ukrainian Roma people, and survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, the elderly, and people with disabilities. If we move to supply chains, we know that global supply chains are tainted by forced labor, from fast fashion and agriculture to technological goods. So to ensure supply chain transparency and accountability, and to ensure workers' rights are being protected and promoted, upheld and respected, it is imperative for governments to introduce import controls on goods being produced using forced labor, which is what the US has recently done with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, prohibiting the importation of any goods that are being produced from the Xinjiang Autonomous Region of China. And this must also be accompanied by provisions to tackle supply chain exploitation in trade agreements, and through the use of mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence laws to hold companies responsible and accountable. And due diligence laws have been drafted in Germany, and the EU has a substantially comprehensive draft plan, which we are hoping will be implemented this coming year, or if not, the beginning of 2024. With regards to the specific intersection between climate change and modern slavery, there is a strong correlation. Climate change, environmental disasters, and degradation contribute to this vicious cycle of displacement, of heightened insecurities and vulnerabilities, which thus lead to increased risks of modern slavery and human trafficking. We know that in areas surrounding areas that are prone to climate change, that traffickers are active and they're ready to take advantage of these vulnerabilities. And something the EU is pushing a lot is this whole narrative of this just transition. And I'd like to make it clear that I wholeheartedly agree with colleagues that we need to see this just transition to renewable energy sources. But a just transition to renewable energy must ensure decent work for all workers, and it cannot be and must not be dependent on forced labor. It must tackle forced labor in mineral extraction and in the manufacture of technologies. And so, for example, within this just transition narrative, there is this huge emphasis on shifting to solar energy. But currently, nearly every solar panel in production is made using forced labor, in particular Uyghur forced labor from the Xinjiang region of China. And so there are very much two distinct conversations happening: climate action and human rights. And if they're not being discussed together with their intersections recognized, then we're going to have a big problem. We have to have this human rights-based and people-centered approach to climate action and climate justice and this includes in this just transition too. And this is very much a fascinating intersection, the climate change and modern slavery nexus. And if you would like to research it further, I can guide you to a piece of research that was published by Anti-Slavery International. It's a report called From a Vicious to a Virtuous Cycle, addressing climate change, environmental degradation, and contemporary slavery. So if that's an area that you're interested in, that's the place to go. And I'd also like to briefly touch upon the impact on women and girls too, and how women and girls in all the diversity and gender minorities are disproportionately impacted by modern slavery. So as I mentioned previously, the Walk Free Foundation estimates that 1 in every 130 women and girls are in modern slavery globally, which is a shocking statistic. But really, it's the societal constructs of the gender binary, of the patriarchy, these constructs that have been created to uphold imbalances in power. And this is because sexism, discrimination, misogyny, and gender inequalities are very much rooted in the political and socioeconomic structures of our system, societies, and cultures. You know, the legislations and societal attitudes that we abide by and the distorted requirements enforced on children, especially girls, as a result, intensifies these imbalances, which thus exacerbates the vulnerabilities of women and girls and gender minorities to modern slavery. So essentially, you know, to end modern slavery in all its forms, we have a ridiculously long way to go. The 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, in particular, Goal 8.7, states that we should be working towards ending modern slavery and human trafficking in all its forms by 2030, and ending child labor and the use of child soldiers in armed conflict by 2025. Unfortunately, as optimistic as I would like to be, we're not going to achieve those targets, but we hope that in my lifetime, at least, we'll see a reduction in the rates of human trafficking and modern slavery globally. But in order to do so, we need to see those systemic and structural changes. So in essence, I've given a very brief overview of what is an incredibly broad, deep, and complex topic, but we do have many of the solutions already. You know, the legislation can be adopted to effectively reduce supply chain forced labor. We know that grassroots organizations have the programs to support survivors. They just need to be adequately resourced and funded. The judicial processes to protect survivors, to have a human rights-based criminal justice approaches, making sure that survivors are being treated as human beings rather than criminals, you know, are there and ready to be adopted. Essentially, we just need the political and the corporate will to act. So moving forward, what we as youth and the anti-slavery sector, what we really want to see is this concrete, this effective and ambitious action. So we really need to start taking this issue seriously. And one of the threads of this action is the meaningful co-leadership of youth within the anti-slavery movement and beyond too. Because young people are an essential missing piece in the current anti-modern slavery movement. Our effective and meaningful participation as co-creators, co-leaders, and co-owners across all levels and all levels of efforts and decision-making is critical. Mobilizing young people as agents of change is becoming more common across social justice movements and discourse. It is time for the anti-slavery sector in particular to invest, amplify, and support youth leadership. And this starts by recognizing our value, our expertise, and the mutual benefits that we bring to the table. Because there is extraordinary power in including young people in intergenerational collaboration and leadership. You know, through this collaboration and partnership, and by recognizing our contributions, you know, we can collectively embark on a journey of learning, of growth, and strengthening and building up our capacity to end modern slavery. Because young people across the world, and I speak from experience, are already working on the front lines. We're driving change from the local to the international levels. And through harnessing our unique expertise, enhanced by our determination, proactivity, and innovation, we can really support in catalyzing long-term and impactful action. And so since our launch in 2017 with Stolen Dreams, and more recently with the Youth for Freedom Collective, we are really committed to working with all stakeholders, including governments and intergovernmental organizations, to promote youth leadership, underpinned by the values and principles of young feminist leadership, which is the words you see on the screen have all come from grassroots young feminists and consultation with them. And these are the phrases and the language that we really take to the UN and to member states in particular too. So fundamentally, we want the sector to work together with us towards achieving this long-term, impactful and meaningful engagement with young people. And again, this includes these foundational principles you see on the screen. So it's time to transform the anti-slavery movement. It's time to realize its full potential by investing in meaningful youth engagement and inclusion, not as only beneficiaries, but as valued and equal partners at the table. So essentially, internationally coordinated, multi-stakeholder and intergenerational partnership is what is needed, combined with these systemic changes to end exploitation. And despite having their respective challenges, they are achievable. because it really is not radical to want all human beings to be free, to have access to basic human rights. And as youth within the modern slavery, the anti-slavery movement and sector, we will persevere and we will not stop fighting until modern slavery in all its forms is completely eradicated. But thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me today. And I'm sure that leaves plenty of time for an interactive discussion and some questions.
It definitely does. And thank you very much, Ishaan, for showing us such a broad spectrum of, I suppose, all the aspects of modern day slavery and its different forms and how we can fight it. And maybe to kick off the discussion, so I would ask a question about the frameworks that maybe cause modern day slavery or ones that sort of reinforce it where it is happening. Are there particular trends that you would spot in Europe or globally that can sort of prove favorable conditions for modern slavery to be perpetuated?
Yeah, that's a great question. The main example the standard example I would give is that in India, for example, there's every form of modern slavery exists there. And of course, we can trace that back to colonial legacies, but also in terms of how the infrastructure there is not substantial enough to support survivors, for example, of exploitation, which means that essentially when you have the compounding crisis in India, for example, of gender inequalities, which is massive there, of poverty, of hunger, of lack of access to quality education. These are all driving factors of exploitation, which means that you have millions of women and girls and children in particular who are entering modern slavery in various different forms. What this also means is that when they do come out of situations of exploitation, there's no infrastructure to then prevent re-victimization. And ultimately, you see this vicious cycle happening. We know in the UK, for example, that through this Ukrainian refugee scheme, there was trafficking happening internally within the UK when Ukrainians were coming from Ukraine into the UK. They were being exploited. Traffickers were taking advantage of the system because the government hadn't put adequate checks and balances on sort of their sign-up system that you could do to house Ukrainian refugees. Same happened when the Afghanistan crisis occurred. And we know that across borders from going out of Ukraine into Poland, huge levels of trafficking there. But again, this is an issue that's happening on our high streets, issue that we can physically see, but also that's happening literally in the clothes we wear, in the foods we eat, and potentially the technology that we're using. I'm sure the technology you're tuning into today, and I'm using an Apple device, is produced using modern slavery. And that's the matter of fact.
If I can maybe jump in on the back of what you just said, obviously it's pretty depressing to hear that sort of everything has a possibility that there has been enslaved people are not being paid enough behind it. Very simply, how can we stop that from being the case? Because ultimately the economic reason behind it is they get away from it in the countries they're from. And you mentioned in China, of course, is actively being used as a way to subjugate a whole people. So what are some of the steps you hope to see that will manage to eliminate this? And how do you avoid the brutally disgusting economic reality that is beneficial for those who exploit labor?
That's a very loaded question. I wish I had all the answers to that. I think the first steps that we need to see is that governments need to recognize what modern slavery is. Governments are often perpetrating modern slavery. We know the UK is through their hard border policies, through the anti-immigration policies as well, with this nationality and borders bill, for example, as well, it's going to increase the rates of human trafficking. In China, we know state-imposed forced labor is happening. In India, it's implicit state-imposed forced labor is happening too. In Qatar, with the World Cup as well. We just need governments to recognize what modern slavery is. And that means coming to the table and agreeing on what a definition of modern slavery is, for example, something as simple as that. But then also recognizing that they themselves are the perpetrators. Modern slavery is such a broad and complex issue. It covers so many different areas that the only way we're going to eradicate it is by addressing those root causes. And that sometimes means detaching ourselves from this modern slavery narrative and looking at other global issues. So, dealing with gender inequalities, dealing with climate change, dealing with poverty, all incredibly broad and complex issues that have hundreds of years of history that underpin them and allow those issues to thrive, really. And so I don't really have a simple answer for you as to how we can start ending it. It really just starts by addressing those root causes. And that points to much wider conversations about how can we, if it's possible, to restructure our economic systems. How does democracy work? How does that come into play? when the state themselves is perpetrating it? What are the legacies of colonialism? What is the responsibility, the common and differentiated responsibilities of the global north, for example, on perpetrating modern slavery in the global south through supply chain exploitation? It brings a lot of conversations. And I think for us, the main focus is what do we do to ensure that survivors of exploitation are supported so that they don't get re-victimized. And that's where we see the most visible impact, the most visible change.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that was kind of a fixed capitalism question as well, which I didn't want to get into, but I appreciate it. And I don't want to monopolize the debate, but one thing you said that I think is very important is that any definition that sort of comes to the table that's worth anything will show that governments are complicit. And of course, they do not want that because that can open so many legal issues in cases of their own country. Is there any way you think that could be reconciled? Would almost an amnesty some way so that, let's say, yes, you've been complicit, but we're not going to try you legally. Let's move on from this, be a way forward? Or do you think that's going to be an inevitable clash that we can't get over?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you an example of the 2001 Palermo Protocol, which is the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, and that supplements the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. And within this protocol, there is a definition of trafficking in persons that was heavily negotiated, very contested. It's a very watered down, vague, weak, toothless definition that essentially, and the main issue for that was because there were certain states who constituted sex work as human trafficking and not as work. And that's still a massive debate that goes on today. It's a massive debate within UN Women, for example, which means that it makes our life so much harder because they just won't touch the issue of human trafficking as a whole because of this debate over what constitutes as sex work and what constitutes as sex trafficking. In 2014, states reconvened to discuss a definition on forced labor. Again, very weak, as you can imagine, because a lot of states are perpetuating forced labor in the first place. So really, as you know, I want to be optimistic and say that it's time that states can come to the table and agree on a definition for what modern slavery is. But that's really not the case. We know that India, for example, doesn't like using the term slavery. They refer to it as contemporary forms of exploitation. Within the UN system as well, they don't use modern slavery, they use contemporary forms of slavery, which I don't really get the difference. But all this wishy-washy language makes a difference at the UN level. But I think what can make a difference is if states do it independently, and if we see national legislation adopted. We saw that in 2015 with the Modern Slavery Act, which is now pathetic and very toothless. But it's a start. And we know New Zealand is in conversation about adopting the Modern Slavery Act. Australia is strengthening theirs and revising theirs too. Germany is already doing great work on tackling modern slavery. And the UK is slipping on its international lead. And I use that term very loosely, lead. But yeah, it's up to the states themselves. And of course, this is where our work with UN really comes to a roadblock, is this notion of sovereignty and respecting states. The UN is a member state driven process. And so a lot of our advocacy that we do at the UN happens behind closed doors. And we're reaching out to governments missions in New York and Geneva and Vienna, but also in capital as well, to really work on really pressuring them and going through the back doors of negotiations too.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And Ishaan, in your previous answer there, you sort of talked about sort of sovereign states and the UN level. And if we sort of focus on the UN level for a minute, what can be achieved to fight modern slavery at UN level that couldn't perhaps be achieved at state level, or are there particular challenges that can't be overcome at the UN if we are to try to make real progress on this?
Yes, that's a good question as well. So the UN regularly adopts resolutions on human trafficking. They don't use modern slavery as much. And they do adopt resolutions where the words modern slavery are written into them. So like, for example, with the Commission on the Status of Women, which happens every year. It's the largest intergovernmental gathering of states to advance gender equality in the UN system. Last year, the focus was on gender equality in the context of climate change. And we were speaking to the UK negotiators, and in the final text adopted by the General Assembly resolution, there are paragraphs that allude to how climate change contributes to modern slavery. And just having certain words in UN resolutions is quite useful because it's precedents, but they're not legally binding, which is where implementation falls short. The way the UN works on tackling modern slavery and human trafficking in particular is through the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, which when a state subscribes to it does become legally binding, and the provisions there can be implemented. So there's a lot of good constructive dialogue happening on that. Actually, for the first time, youth participated in it last year, which was sort of a momentous moment, as small as it sounds. But it was quite important for us to have a presence in the room with member states. But that's one way of accountability. The Human Rights Council is also a pretty good place for action on modern slavery to happen too, with the UPR, so the Universal Periodic Review, which is when states are reviewed by 2 other member states, and they really have a human rights record scrutinized. So the UK just had theirs done, and a number of anti-slavery organizations submitted evidence to the 2 states that were reviewing the UK, and I forget them off the top of my head. But they were, they had to sit on a panel in the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and they were effectively scrutinized for their record, and modern slavery was brought up. Another way is through special procedures in Geneva, so the UN special rapporteurs. There's 2, there's one on contemporary forms of slavery, and there's one on trafficking in persons, especially of women and children. Again, not sure why there's 2 separate people, and it's not under the same mandate, but a result of member state politics and negotiations. But essentially, they can take complaints of individuals to the UN, and they do country visits as well. They produce reports. It's a good way of holding states accountable, and we have seen movement, particularly in some South American states, with the UN Contemporary Forms of Slavery special rapporteur. But also, we are seeing regular communication with those 2 rapporteurs, with the UK government, for example, on really scrutinizing their policies and how they impact and will eventually exacerbate the rates of human trafficking into and out of the country.
Good. I think in terms of moving on to another thing, perhaps if we change track and maybe talk about stolen dreams, I suppose that's sort of maybe the start point before everything else came. But what was your original inspiration for setting it up, and what were the initial parts of your engagement with trying to fight modern slavery like?
Yeah, so growing up, my parents used to take me to India. I had met children who were survivors of modern slavery or child exploitation, or were vulnerable to exploitation. When I first met these children, I was 11 at the time. No idea what modern slavery was. It was only when I was 13 in 2016 that I found out what modern slavery was. And I was shocked because at school we were taught about historic slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. And we were told that it was, William Wilberforce led the way, through Parliament, abolished slavery, and that was it, wiped off the face of the earth. What we weren't told are 2 particular things. One was that, as I mentioned earlier, is that abolition meant that the legal ownership of another person was abolished. It didn't abolish exploitative practices, which are those very exploitative practices that we see today. Another thing that we failed to learn was that Wilberforce was just a mouthpiece for what was happening in Parliament. It was really the mobilization of grassroots enslaved persons who led abolition, and it was only possible without them, or it was only possible with them, and with their mobilization, with the petitions they sent to Parliament, and with that grassroots organizing that happened. And so in 2016, I was doing a project at school over a period of 6 months. I asked all 150 children in my sort of class at school, do you know modern slavery exists? Not one of them knew. I did some research. I found the information online was very hard for me as a 13-year-old to understand. What is the supply chain, for example? What is sexual exploitation? What is forced labor? What is this convention? What does decent work mean? What are labor rights? I had no idea what these things meant. I noticed that actually the climate movement was bringing young people into the conversation. The gender movement was slowly starting to bring young people into the conversation, but the anti-slavery movement was very much in its own bubble, reserved for the academics and the experts in the sector. And it was at that moment that I thought, okay, you know what? I have the privilege and resources to do something more. I cannot just sit here and do nothing. Let me create a website. And Stolen Dreams really started as this awareness raising organization to really simplify that information on modern slavery in a digestible manner for young people. And then from there, a couple of years later, I sort of had this awakening moment where I was like, okay, raising awareness is not enough. It's not enough for a young person to share a post on social media. I call it a day. When this is an issue that we're encountering, from the minute we wake up to the minute we go to sleep, and even during our sleep too, realistically. And I thought, okay, so what role can we as young people play at the table, at the decision-making table? Is there a way? And of course, there's definitely a way, because we're seeing that there are decisions being made about young people who are survivors of exploitation without even including their voices. There are members of parliament who are sitting in the UK who don't even know that modern slavery exists. These are people running our country. And I think there is so much capacity that we as young people can, use, and there are so many ways that we can take action because it's such a broad and diverse topic. We really find our own niche, and we can act in that respect too. But also recognizing that children will eventually grow up and enter the labor force. One, it means that they could be vulnerable to exploitation, but two, they would be sitting in positions of power in companies and in the public sector, in the private sector, that could be perpetrating forced labor and modern slavery in the first place. So just having that consciousness as to due diligence, for example, or human rights, even environmental justice too, is really important. And that's why we as Solid Dreams focus on those three areas of education, of advocacy, and policy too, and taking that combined approach.
Yeah, and in terms of government policy as well, would you sometimes find that particular governments would have an interest in trying to fight modern slavery almost for their own ends, or do you sometimes have governments who, in the same way that some might tacitly enable or facilitate it, might try to reduce the presence of modern slavery for political purposes or for some other intention?
Yeah, I realize this meeting is recorded as well, so I'd be very diplomatic in what I say.
Of course.
But yeah, the answer to that is yes. So there is always a political incentive behind every decision governments are taking. At the UN level, it's very evident. There are certain areas that states will compromise on, certain areas that they will really push hard against or fight for. But we are seeing that at a UN level, the UK is very much leading the way on combating modern slavery and human trafficking. And as much as what's happening nationally is happening, they're very much pushing at the international level, which is great to see, and we really like to see that. We are very much here to support that too. Of course, there are a number of states who push back against this rhetoric too. China, Russia, Iran, Afghanistan will not touch the issue and will regress on any language that they see in text about it. Yeah, I can say those states, it's fine. They already know that I'm speaking against them anyways, so it's okay.
Well, good. I suppose for any recording, we always have to be careful what we ask as well. So apologies for the question in the first place. But and even I suppose when trying to implement, and you talked earlier about the difficulties with implementation, are there any sort of methods or any mechanisms that can be used to try to enforce compliance with legislation or with proposals, or is it really just up to trying to convince every country and companies as well, I suppose, or whatever it is, that it is in their interest as well as the interests of humanity generally to end modern slavery?
Essentially, it is that, and we see that in the climate movement too, is that it's about appealing to states and getting them to do the right thing. The issue is that when one state does it, it's not enough. When the UK adopts the Modern Slavery Act, and New Zealand, Germany, Australia, that's four, right? 4 states out of the 193, or that's at least how many states are in the UN. But modern slavery is an issue that's so internationally, it's so global, that it's so interconnected with different states. You can't just have one state adopt legislation. You can't even have one private sector company eradicate forced labor in the supply chains, because it just means that with competition and everything, their profit margins will reduce. That's just the way our economic systems work, is that it's always profit maximizing and competing against different brands. So as much as Apple back in 2017 were taking strides to tackle modern slavery in supply chains, it slowed down, and the progress stopped because they were in competition with other brands like Microsoft and these other tech companies. Same for fast fashion. ASOS is doing great work with Slavery International to eradicate slavery in the supply chains. Again, how many other fast fashions are doing the same thing? Close to none. So really, it's about appealing to the states, appealing to those companies, so that getting them to take internationally coordinated and collective action together too. But also recognizing as well that if we're talking about supply chains in particular, supply chains are very complex. They're very tiered. Essentially, the CEO of a company is not going to know what's happening at the bottom of their supply chain in the 4th or 5th tier. It's about having that transparency and communication across suppliers, but also across those at the top of the company too, which is really important. Again, not excusing their unethical business practices, but just recognizing that it is a complex process, and it does take a bit of time before we can see any movement. But essentially what we're asking for is transparency, and that's where a company like, I'm not sure you've heard of Tony's Chocolonely, very famous chocolate company known for promoting supply chain transparency. and for really committing to eradicating forced labor, and in particular child labor in the chocolate supply chains. They had a scandal last year. I'm not sure if you saw in the papers, it was a huge thing that erupted, and they were like, they found child labor in the supply chains. They got very much attacked for it. And I think there was some miscommunication there, because Tony Chocolonely doesn't say they're slave free, they say they're trying to be slave free. And when they found child labor in their supply chain, the first thing they did was went to the media and said, we found child labor in our supply chain, but here is what we are doing to address it. And I think that is something that's so crucial, is that when a brand finds exploitation, they don't cover it up, or they don't change supplier, leave all those workers in destitute and behind, but they actively work with their supplier to reverse those exploitative conditions and making sure those workers are getting access to basic human rights, basic labor rights, and services and support. And that's exactly what Tony Chocolonely did. And we need to see brands do more of that, is identify slavery with their supply chains, be transparent about it, and then actively work to eradicate it.
If it's okay though, Stefan, now again, I'm not expecting you to be an encyclopedia for all the cases here, but do you know of any successful cases where companies found to be using modern slavery in the supply chain were taken legally, to court, or the government did crack down, and there was a sustained and successful sort of case against them? Because so much of what we're talking about today is voluntary. Countries have to voluntarily do this, companies have to voluntarily do this, but of course, ideally we live in a rules-based system, ideally, that helps enforcement. Are there any success stories you think we can build on in ways that we can work in the future?
Not that I know of, no.
Oh, I didn't mean to make that a bit of a sadder.
No, it's a good, and that's why we need to see national laws adopted, and even something as simple as due diligence laws are so important to then holding companies accountable in the court of law, because they're legally then obliged to subscribe to certain business practices. The issue is that when laws are adopted on due diligence, companies will then move to another country, and
Yes.
again, it's just a way of avoiding these things. We know that when the US were adopting the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, Nike and Apple were heavily lobbying against the implementation of that legislation, because they supply from the Uyghur Xinjiang region, despite claiming tribunals and these courts that they had nothing to do with that area. So yeah, I mean, you need to see those national laws, but they have to be, and that's why the global North countries need to be adopting these legislations, but also it's got to be, and I'm generalizing with global North, global South, but that's got to be complemented with legislation in the global South on labor rights and making sure those labor rights are enforced. It's got to be that partnership between states. As much as I want to put faith in the corporate sector, in the private sector and corporates, right now it's very much we need to see that government legislation happen first, and then we can move to corporates and look at social responsibility and all of these new terms that have popped up over the past 5-10 years.
Is it fair to say it's one of those issues where sort of everyone has to do better, sort of simultaneously, because it cannot be done sort of by step by different people?
No, exactly. And that's why when we look at the sector, the anti-slavery sector, for example, is overworked and underfunded and under-resourced. But the way that we see it is that, if we're going to end modern slavery, we have to address those root causes, right? And very much so, the modern slavery sector is focused on supporting survivors, making sure that survivors are getting the support they need, whether that's legal support, translation services, mental health services, education for children who then come out of exploitation. What the sector is not looking at is how do we then address the root causes that enable exploitation in the first place. And there's a slight shift to that narrative as well. We cannot stop with support for survivors, but we also have to recognize subconsciously as well that we're asking for a lot of funding on projects on the ground that are working on prevention, but it's very much putting a band-aid on the issue. We need to look at the deeper structural issues. And that means recognizing that we do our part as the anti-slavery sector, but we leave the other stuff to the other movements that are happening, like the climate movement, the gender movements, and looking at them and investing in them too.
Thank you.
I suppose in terms of thinking towards the future as well, another question maybe for yourself would be, where do you see the fight against modern slavery, or even modern slavery itself around the world, being in maybe 5 or 10 years' time? Do you think that there are fairly consistent things that will sort of remain a problem or remain sort of main causes or effects of it, or do you think that those trends could change a lot in the next sort of 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's hard to say. I mean, the pandemic came and we had huge spikes in modern slavery, human trafficking, the impacts of which are still being felt today. With the rise of technology and social media, we know that technology facilitating human trafficking is on the increase. With the rise of, even in the metaverse, there are, been cases of modern slavery and human trafficking online as well. Artificial intelligence as well is being used to perpetrate modern slavery. We know the continuing effects of climate change, it's going to get worse. It's going to exacerbate modern slavery, human trafficking. We know that as conflicts continue to exist, human trafficking will be present. So it's a very pessimistic way of looking at it. But I think if we have that shift on a political level, where governments are then recognizing modern slavery exists and recognizing they have a duty to address it, I think within our lifetime, we will see the rates of exploitation decrease. But of course, we look at this issue more holistically as well. Climate action, of course, is one of the main issues that our generation is fighting for. At the rate we're going, it doesn't look too good, but we have to remain hopeful at least. Otherwise, we will spiral and enter an existential crisis, which I don't really want to do. But I mean, there's a whole, I think working in the human rights sector, and this analogy I always use is like your foot is wedged in a door that's being repeatedly slammed onto your foot. And often it means that your foot will be sore and you need to take a break. And it's just about recognizing that there are people out there who will hold the door open for you, even if it's just for a brief moment while you take that break. There are so many millions, if not billions of young people who are working on the ground, who are working on so many different global issues. And it's about just, trusting that everyone is working on their niche and working towards that common goal of, as cliche as it sounds, but making the world a better place and blah, blah, blah. But yeah, it's the hope that we cling on to.
No, it's definitely the hope is something we have to hang on to and things. I suppose not trying to play devil's advocate or anything, but are there things that you think sort of warrant sort of a lack of hope at the minute, or sort of more concern at the minute? There are certain things that if you were sort of Secretary General of the UN yourself, would there be particular things that you would think need to be done right now? Are there sort of very pressing things that you think need to be changed or altered or done right now, really, sort of like in this moment, to sort of really kickstart that change, that development?
Yeah, I mean, there's simple issues of like the sustainable development goals. The fact that the symbol is a circle it in itself just shows how intersectionality plays a huge part, right? You can't just pick a goal. You can't just, you can't just solve climate change, for example, and then say job done. That's it. You solve climate change, gender inequality solved. Right? That's just not the case. If we solve poverty, then it means that we have a good footing to solve a number of different other issues. There are certain issues that make a bigger impact or contribute more, but it doesn't mean that it will essentially rid the world of the evils that we're facing today. So we have to have that coordinated approach, and that's why intersectionality is so important. And that's why there's not a hierarchy of the different global issues that we face today, because we're talking about people's lives at this point, right? They're not just numbers or not the status or statistics. These are actual human beings who are not thinking about how to change from sort of fossil fuels to renewable energy, that when they're thinking about where the next meal is going to come from, or how much water they'll be able to obtain for their family to drink, right? I think the onus is often placed on us as individuals to make the change to consume consciously and to buy ethical and all of this, when actually the responsibility falls on governments and the corporates who have been perpetuating these systems of inequalities for centuries now. And then that points to more holistic conversations about how the way the international system works. And this is what we do at the UN system is, the intervention I gave just now at the youth briefing on the implementation of the Secretary General's Our Common Agenda. I spoke about accountability, about power dynamics, about how the legacies of, about how we need to see decloning approaches to the way the UN works. And these are all things that, in every space within the UN system we occupy is something that we're always saying when we engage in conversation with member states. It's very much the UN was built in a strategic way to uphold certain ideals. It was built by a certain demographic of people as well. It's inherently tokenistic, inherently exclusionary. There's a lot of systemic barriers to participation, not only for young people, but just general civil society too, especially for those who face multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and marginalization, violence. And we talk about UN reform, which is a very scary topic in the UN. You say that you probably get blacklisted in the system, but it's about slowly nudging the UN system and telling them that actually the way the UN is working is not working, and you need to change. Incrementally, fine, but there has to be a sense of urgency, because the issues that we're facing today are not going to go away, and just because they're not affecting you in New York or in Geneva or Vienna or wherever you are, doesn't mean they're not important, and doesn't mean they don't require your attention. And that's where my issues with the UN come into play, is that why do we wait for these major summits and commissions and conferences to discuss these issues when realistically we could be doing it today? UN member states are always in conversation with each other. Why do we have to wait for these big formal processes where people fly from all over the world and deliver speeches and statements, etc., to commit to things? And very much UN language is always we commit, we pledge to this, and then it takes 10 years before you see any form of action. But I mean, again, that's my cynical side of the UN coming out. The UN does a lot of great stuff. It's working a lot on the ground with communities, with people. And we're seeing that slow incremental change that is very much being called for by young people and very much being pushed for by young people, which is, again, the thread of hope that we really cling on to.
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more myself. And one final question, and I apologize if this sounds like a cliche question, but as a final question, are there things that we, as the individual on this call, or young people, young professionals, students, and so on, what can people of our generation do in day-to-day life to really try to fight modern slavery in small ways? Or are there things that people can bear in mind, or think actions that they can take to try to incrementally cause change if enough people start taking action?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the responsibility shouldn't be on us as individuals to end modern slavery and human trafficking. As I said, it's the political world, the corporate world to act essentially. But it doesn't mean that we can't, consume consciously, for example, slow our consumption rates, source locally, ask brands the questions, who made your clothes, how much would they pay per piece of work, per piece of garment produced, for example. This may seem like a very insignificant questions, but even if you comment on a brand's social media post, for example, underneath and say, how much your work is paid, that brings other people. And if you go onto Zara or H&M's Instagram page, you have thousands of people looking at their post. It brings them into the conversation too. Just raising awareness of the issue, having the general understanding as to what modern slavery is really important. But then also taking that into the space that you occupy. Whether you go into government or whether you go into the corporate world. Taking that thinking with you, and then challenging the company that you're working within to look into these practices as well. Speak to your local government ministers, your national ministers. I don't know where everyone's tuning in from, but you speak to your politicians, tell them that more needs to be done. It's their civic duty to represent you at the governmental level. To really engage with that at a very grassroots level. Volunteer for organizations, as I said. Organizations are overworked, underfunded. They're always looking for support, whether that's something simple as translating documents or support services into various languages, or volunteering at a shelter, for example, or providing psychological help to survivors, or fundraising even. There's so many ways that we as young people can support. And of course, if anybody does want to get more involved in the sector in terms of education, or even in more political aspects as well, you're more than welcome to contact me. Happy to support, happy to help.
Well, on that note, I think we will bring this to an end. But Ishaan, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to come and talk to us and to share everything that you have. It's great to hear your enthusiasm and also just the insights that you have about this issue in ways that we talk about. Thank you very much for coming to talk to us today about it.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, thank you very much. I think we will call it a night there. I'm not sure where people are tuning in from exactly, but at least it's night time where I think most of us are. So thank you very much, Ishaan, one more time. And thank you for everyone for coming.
All right, so if anyone has any questions or anything comes to mind after, just drop me a message or an email.
Thank you very much, Ishaan.
Thank you very much.